This is the Inspired Pilot Podcast, episode 22.
If you're feeling really good because of having a low oxygen level, you may not recognize that that is a deficit in oxygen. And unfortunately, as time goes on at that level, your cognitive abilities become diminished and mistakes start happening, and pilots can actually become incapacitated.
Inspiring stories from inspiring pilots from around the world. Welcome to the Inspired Pilot Podcast with your host, Marvin Robinson.
Okay, welcome to the Inspired Pilot Podcast. This is Marvin Robinson, and I'm delighted to introduce today's featured inspiring pilot, Brent Blue. Welcome to the show, Brent. Are you ready to inspire today?
Absolutely, Marvin. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Let's go. Brent Blue is a Senior Aviation Medical Examiner who introduced Digital Pulse Oximetry to general aviation in 1995. He has been the team doctor for the US Unlimited Aerobatic Team at the World Competition in Hungary and lectures extensively on hypoxia and carbon monoxide at altitude. Dr. Blue flies a Cessna 340, a Cessna 185, and a 450 Stearman out of his home airport near Jackson Hole in the United States. Okay, I've given our listeners, the Inspired Pilots, a short introduction there, Brent. I've mentioned that your home airport is near Jackson Hole in the United States, but can you take a minute, tell us a little bit about yourself personally, where you're from, and before we jump deeper into your journey, can you just give us a brief overview of what you're doing aviation-wise right now?
I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, and I grew up literally down the street from Bowman Field, which at that time was a very, very active general aviation airport. And I always wanted to learn to fly. And finally, in college one summer, I was taking a college summer course, and I spent the rest of the time learning to fly. So I've been a pilot now for about 45 years. I know I don't sound that old, Marvin, but I am. And I've accumulated quite a few hours, and I moved to Jackson Hole about 33 years ago. And the unique thing about flying in the Jackson Hole area is that our base altitude is 6,200 feet, about 2,000 meters. And so every flight is a high altitude flight. And of course, we're surrounded by mountains, so it's very common for us to get up in the 15, 16, 17,000 foot range. So we have quite a bit of high altitude exposure and quite a bit of mountain flying, which presents its own unique flying issues.
Excellent. Okay, well, I'm really interested to hear about how you got started, especially the impact of those, like you mentioned, every flight is a high altitude flight. But today, Brent, you are our featured inspiring pilot, and on the Inspired Pilot Podcast, we delve into the journeys of our guests. So you touched on it there just briefly, but every journey does have to start somewhere. So tell us that story, Brent, how you first got involved with flying and why you wanted to become a pilot in the first place.
Well, one of the great things about flying in the United States is that it is a tremendous freedom to be able to get into an airplane and fly pretty much anywhere you want to, pretty much any time you want to, given restrictions related to weather. I learned to fly fairly young. I was 20 years old and in college, and have been flying pretty much ever since, and doing everything I could to make flying part of my life. As it turns out, in Jackson, Wyoming, where we live, we are in a very rural area that does not have great airline connections. We do have airlines, but from the point of view of daily life here, going to from Jackson Hole to California, or going to from Jackson Hole to Chicago, or areas like that, it is actually much easier for me to fly myself than to use the airlines, because of various connections we would have to make with the airlines. So that it's become a very handy thing for me living in a rural area. But I've also been able, as a physician, to include aviation as part of my professional life by being a Senior Aviation Medical Examiner for the FAA, which means we do the pilot medicals on a regular basis for both general aviation pilots as well as airline and commuter pilots. And then I started a company called Aeromedix, which is an online company, aeromedix.com, where we sell medical and safety products to pilots. So that's also increased my involvement with aviation on a professional level as well.
Fantastic. So definitely want to touch on your AME, your Aeromedical Examiner role, and your company, as you mentioned, Aeromedix. But let's go back to the beginning. You mentioned that you learned to fly at 20 years old in college. So take us back to that process. Obviously, you're not as young. You're a bit older than you sound, as you said, but let's go back to when you were 20 years old. What sparked your interest? Have you got family interest in aviation? And take us back to the learning process of, making that decision to start your PPL.
Well, the interesting thing is that no one in my family was an aviator. But I've always been sort of a rebel in my family, so it's not unusual that I've done something that no one else in the family has done. But flying was just always something I wanted to do. And the one thing that I can tell your listeners, particularly if they have not started or are in the middle of their training, was that I trained with a instructor who was not a great instructor. And I would recommend that if anybody feels like they're in training and they're not with a good instructor, that they change instructors, because I still have bad habits that I can attribute back to that training 45 years ago. But I learned in Nashville, Tennessee. That's where I was in college that summer, and I flew out of the international airport there. So it was a little bit different, and then I learned to fly in a tower-controlled airport. That did make me comfortable with communications with air traffic control from the onset, where I think some people who learn to fly in small airports that do not have towers get somewhat intimidated by the air traffic control system. But it was always sort of second nature for me to be able to talk to a tower and talk to air traffic control. It also was kind of normal for me to fly with lots of different kinds of aircraft around. In the sense of being at an international airport, I'd be flying with general aviation aircraft, business aircraft, and also big airliners that were coming in frequently to the airport. So I was not intimidated by all that different kinds of traffic. As things progressed, I still flew a little bit in med school. I didn't fly near as much as I wanted to because of constraints of time and money. But then at that time, you had to have 200 hours in order to proceed with your instrument rating. And so as soon as I got 200 hours, during one vacation period, I took 10 days with an instructor and got my instrument rating and felt that was a big advantage to my safety in flying, and that I think having an instrument rating makes one a much safer and much more exacting pilot. So that was my sort of next rating, and I did that in Louisville, Kentucky, where I was in med school. And then I continued to fly on the West Coast when I went out to San Francisco in my residency, and I was in a flying club out there, and got to know a lot about California and all the different areas in California just by having that access with aviation that you just couldn't have done with a car or other transportation.
Fantastic. I love, especially in the UK. I personally, if I have an excuse to fly somewhere for a particular mission, then I'm in my element there, because rather than that $100, £100 hamburger, especially if you can use your access to aircraft, it's always great if you can mix business and flying as an excuse, as it were. Just a quick one though, going back to what you mentioned about, if you have a bad instructor, how would they know they had a bad instructor? Obviously, in hindsight, you know that now, but how could a potential student know they've got a bad instructor?
Well, I think there's two issues. One is whether there's a personality click. In other words, some people's personalities just don't mesh well with someone else's, and if you have an instructor whose personality and yours does not mesh, then you need to go to another instructor, because that's just not a good thing. Yeah. My instructor, the thing that I found to be most disconcerting about him was he tended to be one of these guys who let you make mistakes and then corrected you, as opposed to telling you the right way to do things and making sure you understood the right way to do it before you started that maneuver. Yeah. And I think that if there's any suspect why someone's going through training, they suspect that their instructor may not be very good. They may want to even just have try another instructor for just one lesson, 1 hour, and see if that other instructor seems like a better instructor to them or meshes better with their learning than the one they were with previously. That doesn't mean they have to commit to a new instructor, but they may want to see somebody else.
Yeah, great advice there. It's not a case of hurting the instructor's feelings by going to another instructor. It's a lot of cases as well, which I've anecdotally from other students and other pilots in a lot of training organizations, because of the way the rosters are, you may not get the same instructor all the time anyway. So sometimes you are blessed by, experience another instructor. But yeah, definitely make that choice, make that decision and be brave and move on if necessary. So yeah, great advice there. You've mentioned that you got your PPL, you raced up to 200 hours, got your IR, you moved over to the west coast of the country, and you're definitely using your flying with regards to business. Give us an example of a typical sort of flight you would do, how you integrated flying into your business.
Well, when I was in California, I was in a residency doing my family medicine and emergency medicine residency at the University of California, San Francisco. But I would moonlight in the Central Valley of California. Many of the small emergency rooms down in Central California and these small rural hospitals would need doctors to cover the weekends so that the full-time docs could get some time off, because many of these hospitals only had one or two docs who covered their emergency room. So they would hire people to come down on Friday afternoon and cover the emergency room until Monday morning. So many times I would fly a 𝗶𝗀𝗀𝗃𝗃 260B, which was the aircraft that was part of the club I belonged to, down to these small community hospitals and essentially commute that way. And that actually was just a way I made aviation part of my life. And of course, obviously vacations and other things like that, if I was going to, for a true vacation or a medical meeting, I would try to do everything I could to fly myself versus using the airlines. One of the things, of course, about living in the United States is that we have huge distances between places that we need to be at. So it's a little different in the United Kingdom, where you could drive or take the train and it not be so far. But in the States, it's quite a bit of distance. Even if you're going from San Francisco to Los Angeles, that's basically about a 7-hour drive when it's about a 2-hour flight in a 𝗶𝗀𝗃𝗃 260B.
Wow. Yeah, exactly. So it's like a no-brainer, basically.
Well, it's a no-brainer, but it still is more expensive than driving.
Yeah, it's the no-brainer if you've got the means and the access. Yeah, got it. Okay, so you're on your residency now. You're flying between residency and your moonlighting job. I like the sound of that. Take us on your journey now. Flying-wise, where did you go from there?
Well, the next thing was when I got out of my residency, I initially moved to Mill Valley, California, which is just north of San Francisco. And that's where I became an aviation medical examiner, because that not only allows me to see pilots on a regular basis, but essentially makes me part of the pilot community in that area, because I see so many pilots that are local. But that was one of the things that really got me started in the aviation medicine side of things. I ended up buying a 182 when I was practicing out in Northern California there, and flew as much as I could. Then I moved to Jackson Hole, and actually when I moved to Jackson Hole, I sold the 182 and actually took about 5 or 6 years off from flying, just because of time constraints and having young children and a new medical practice and so on. But then got back into it after that point, and have been flying and using flying for as many business activities as I've been able to do since then.
Fantastic. Okay, I like that. So the choice of becoming an aviation medical examiner, that was your own choice. I guess it's a real small subset of all the qualified medical personnel in the United States. So was this just to sort of satisfy your own sort of need to be closer to aviation, and did it give you any additional privileges?
Well, being an aviation medical examiner certainly allows you to be more integrated into the pilot community locally, because all the local pilots come to you for their examination. And of course, in Jackson, we get a lot of pilots who commute to work. We have a lot of airline pilots here who don't fly out of Jackson, but they commute to Salt Lake or Chicago or Dallas to fly the big iron airliners. But being a medical examiner certainly increases that contact. And then, of course, the examinations we have to take and the courses we have to take to not only become an aviation medical examiner, but to stay current are very interesting and are involved. I have a lot of involvement with the aviation, not only aviation medicine, but aviation physiology, and we get to examine a lot of situations that happen in aviation, whether they're potential accidents or accidents that have already happened, or general safety concerns. And that's how I became interested actually in pulse oximetry, because no one had ever really used a pulse oximeter in general aviation, and some of that was because in pulse oximeters at that time were prescription items, and which meant that you had to have a prescription from a physician to have a pulse oximeter. And being a physician meant that I could dispense pulse oximeters to pilots because I felt it was important for them to have them. And that's how I got involved in the whole pulse oximeter area and got pulse oximeter into general aviation. Of course, now pulse oximeters are over the counter. You don't have to have prescriptions for them in the United States. So it's a little bit different now, but I think everyone who flies should have, at least flies at altitude, should have a pulse oximeter. It's an incredible safety device.
Okay, so every pilot would have had to study the human performance and the effects of hypoxia. So could you just give us an overview of hypoxia and what it actually means to a pilot?
Well, interestingly, hypoxia in the United States was measured in an unusual way. In the 50s, the United States FAA came out with rules for oxygen use that basically said that if you were over 12,500 feet and below 14,000 feet, that you had to use oxygen if you were there for more than 30 minutes. And then if you were over 14,000 feet, you had to use oxygen anytime. Well, the reason the rules were written that way weren't based on science. What they were based on was geography. Oxygen systems at that time were heavy, they were made out of steel, and they were very expensive. And if you had the rule that was 12.5, we call our 12.5 and 14 rule, you could fly anywhere in the United States because you could cross any mountain range in the United States within 30 minutes by going up to as high as 13,999 and be back down, and you could cross any mountain range. So that really meant that no general aviation pilot would legally have to have oxygen. The only problem was that no one had really ever measured oxygen very well at altitude, except in some very unique scientific studies. So once pulse oximetry was invented, we could measure the oxygen levels of pilots at any altitude very easily and very, very inexpensively. And what we found is that some pilots need oxygen, at 8,000 feet or at 6,000 feet. And some pilots may need less oxygen than they think when they're at 15,000 feet. So what has happened is that the science has finally caught up to what hypoxia truly is. And the issue with hypoxia, and one of the reasons it's so dangerous, is hypoxia, which is low oxygen in the bloodstream, is that one of the first symptoms in many people is euphoria. And so if you're feeling really good because of having a low oxygen level, you may not recognize that is a deficit in oxygen. And unfortunately, as time goes on at that level, your cognitive abilities become diminished and mistakes start happening, and pilots can actually become incapacitated. And the reason I say some pilots might have hypoxia at 8,000 feet and some might not need as much oxygen whether at 15,000 feet is because physiologically we're all different. And if we're smokers or we're overweight or we have some lung problems or we have asthma or we have a cold or even allergy symptoms, we might need oxygen at a lower level than somebody who's 25 and healthy as a horse and has no medical issues whatsoever and is a non-smoker and that sort of thing. So it's really hard to determine when you need oxygen unless you have some sort of objective measurement. And that's really why I'm really happy that pulse oximetry has become fairly ubiquitous in aviation now.
Great explanation. Thank you for that. It is sort of scary, really, because in the United Kingdom, anyway, if you're not flying IFR, then you are nowhere near any levels that, as you mentioned. But across Europe, there are several mountain ranges, and, a lot of people fly VFR at 10,000 feet as a given with no thought to oxygen at that level. I think the general consensus is 10,000, you're right, sort of thing. So it is interesting to hear how a lot of flying happens in the summer. People suffer with allergy issues, and this can, have a detrimental effect on your ability to take the oxygen out of the air. That's not even talking about any medical or physiological differences between pilots. So definitely something to think about.
One of the things that your listeners can do is like a simple experiment that is pretty dramatic. Is go up at just fly at 8,000 feet for a while at night, and 8,000 feet. Most people are not very hypoxic, but the eyes are very sensitive to oxygen deprivation. So you can fly around at night at 8,000 feet and look at the lights on the ground and then put on oxygen. And what they will notice is it looks like somebody has turned up the rheostat. I mean, all the lights on the ground will become much brighter, and all the colors that are on the panel in the cockpit will become much brighter. And it's a very simple kind of experiment to do, but that really does show how important oxygen can be for your vision. And your eyes are extremely sensitive, as I said, to hypoxia. But that's a simple experiment that everybody can do in their aircraft.
Wow, excellent. Based on your experience, you've obviously spoke to a lot of pilots. We mentioned that one size doesn't fit all, but is there sort of some best practices that we can all take into consideration?
Well, the thing that I recommend to pilots is that they have a pulse oximeter, and that they check their oximetry at sea level or whatever their home airport altitude is. And what I mean by that is that if you live at sea level and your saturation is 97%, that's fine. And of course, if you live where I live at 6,200 feet, normal is 90 to 95%. So we say your saturation might be 93% if you lived in Jackson Hole.
Yeah.
But what we recommend is, let's say the pilot's 97% at sea level, and that's where they live. What we would recommend is that if they should use oxygen if their saturation drops to 92%, and that they must use oxygen if their saturation drops 10 points or 87%. So we call it our 5 and 10 rule. If they drop 5 points, they should use oxygen, and if they drop 10 points from their home saturation, then they must use oxygen. And I think that's a fairly good rule of thumb to use oxygen in aircraft.
Great, and I think that's actually a better bit of advice than what I was actually sort of looking for there, because I was sort of asking for a sort of blanket, what could best practice, but you've actually given you've mentioned using the pulse oximeter, taking actual physical measurements and having some metrics to work with, and that takes into the consideration of how your body works. So that's even better. The 5 and 10 rule: 5 you should use, 10 you must use. Excellent.
Right. And the problem is if you don't have a pulse oximeter, it's very hard to judge how hypoxic you might be. And that's where the rub comes in. The one thing I should point out, though, for people who do have pulse oximeters, is one thing that fools pulse oximeters is carbon monoxide. And if you have carbon monoxide in your system, it is read as oxygen on the pulse oximeter. And so that's one of the areas that does fool a pulse oximeter, is carbon monoxide in your bloodstream.
Okay. And that carbon monoxide in the cockpit is a byproduct of leaks from the engine. Is that correct?
It is. It's a byproduct of combustion, and it's from the exhaust. And so we actually also introduced, through Aeromedix, digital carbon monoxide detectors. And these are detectors that are low level, so they start reading at 10 parts per million, because the reason we wanted these as opposed to the inexpensive hardware store kind that start reading at 35 parts per million is you don't want to know when the number is critical. You want to know when the number is low and is increasing, because you don't want to end up with an emergency in the aircraft. You want to know that something is going on. So when we introduced these, we thought that we would see a lot of carbon monoxide leaks around the heater muffs, because the heater muffs on single-engine aircraft are what provide the heat, and they're basically a air muff around the exhaust pipe. So they take the heat from the exhaust pipe, and that's what creates the hot air that comes into the cabin. And we thought that leaks in that system would be where we got a lot of carbon monoxide reports. And it turns out we didn't get that many. We were sort of surprised. And we suppose that the reason was that these areas get inspected every year during the aircraft annual, and they're inspected very closely. What we did see, though, was carbon monoxide leaks in many other places. We saw carbon monoxide leaks through the wheel wells of retractable gear aircraft. We saw carbon monoxide leaks at the door seals of the aircraft. We saw swirling exhaust around the fuselage that literally got sucked up from the tail cone back into the cockpit. Because you have to remember that inside the cockpit of an aircraft, that is a negative pressure due to Venturi forces. So exhaust, if it's outside in the right spot, it will get sucked into the cockpit. I'll tell you a very interesting story about that. I was flying with a employee who was a non-aviator in an open cockpit biplane, and she was in the front seat, I was in the back seat, and I'd flown this plane for quite some time, and she said to me after the flight, she said, I think I'm getting carbon monoxide poisoning. And I said, no way, 100 miles an hour open cockpit aircraft, no way that could be happening. And so we took a carbon monoxide detector up, and it turned out that while we were taxiing, she was getting about 100 parts per million of carbon monoxide in the front cockpit. And when we were actually in flight at 100 miles an hour, she was getting about 40 parts per million in the front hole. And,
Wow.
and in the back hole, where I was, the back seat, I was getting minimal carbon monoxide. And it just so happens it has to do with the way that the exhaust pipe emits the exhaust and the way it swirls around the cockpit.
Yeah.
And we corrected that problem just by moving, getting a new exhaust system and moving the exhaust output from the side to below the aircraft, and that solved the problem. But, carbon monoxide poisoning can happen the most interesting ways. I had a guy who was an astronaut who flew a Beech 18, a twin-engine aircraft, and usually it's very unusual to get carbon monoxide when the engines are on the wings as opposed to the nose.
Mm-hmm.
And he was taxiing out, and the alarm started going off on his carbon monoxide detector. And it turned out to be because of the way he was, the relationship he had to the ambient air. As he was taxiing out, what was happening was, at idle speeds, the wind that was on the airport at the time was literally blowing the exhaust into his fresh air intake into the cabin.
Fancy that.
And so, so we've had some interesting reports like that.
Wow, these kind of things you either find out the hard way in the accident report, but some of these aircraft have been designed. The Beech 18, that's a very old aircraft. It's probably been like that forever, and for technology just to have to advance to a point to measure this. So I wonder how many other pilots were affected by that particular issue.
Yeah. Interestingly, in the United States, the way that aircraft are certified is they're certified when they're in what's called a green state. And what that means is that, like in the new 182 that Cessna put out, they started putting them out, I guess, about 8-9 years ago now. When they test the aircraft for carbon monoxide, they are basically testing it with a pilot seat in the aircraft and nothing else in the aircraft, no other upholstery or anything else. And they have a liquid that turns colors when there's carbon monoxide exposure. So if the liquid doesn't turn color, then they don't have carbon monoxide issues, and they're done testing. Well, what ended up happening is that one of the options that the Cessna 182 had was air conditioning. And when they put air conditioning in it, it turned out that the air conditioning intake sucked in the exhaust and created high levels of carbon monoxide when somebody turned on the air conditioning in the aircraft.
Wow.
And that was one of those kind of things that you would think that with the high-tech world that we live in now, that wouldn't happen. But that's exactly what happened as recently as 8 or 9 years ago.
Yeah, how was that, as it were, quote, inverted commas, detected? Was that an incident, or was it picked up by someone's...
It was actually picked up by somebody who bought one of our carbon monoxide detectors, And they literally worked with the Cessna Pilots Association to try to find where they were getting the carbon monoxide. So what they would do was they would go up into test flights and take duct tape and cover different air sources in the aircraft to see which one was bringing in the carbon monoxide. I mean, they literally would tape up the door, fly. They would tape up the other door and fly, and they started taping up, air intakes and so on. And it's when they taped up the air conditioning intake that they discovered that's where the carbon monoxide was coming in.
Wow, it's definitely quite scary because most like cars and a lot of the sort of especially the single-engined older aircraft, you always imagine that there are a lot of air changes per minute or per hour of flight due to the the leakiness. They're not sealed, but who knows what's coming in and via what intake. Personally, just off the back, I hadn't really looked into oxygen, or I'm not a IFR pilot. I'm rarely at those kind of levels. But the carbon monoxide is an issue. I fly with my family, my young children, and that is something which I'm going to be looking into myself personally. So thank you for raising my personal awareness, and I'm sure it's going to help the listeners as well. Okay, well, we've touched on some of the things there. So what else from the point of view of a pilot? So if you were saying to a fresh pilot, they're going to be flying potentially in the levels, what as a sort of a kit, a medical kit, would you recommend?
Well, I actually designed a kit for that very reason, and the reason I designed it was kind of interesting. I was at my son's hockey game at a location about 3 hours from home, and my son got cut, and the only person there who had anything to help was a friend of mine who was a plumber. And so I figured, well, if a plumber had a medical kit, I'd better put one together.
Fantastic.
And so I actually put together a kit that I call a medical kit as opposed to a first aid kit, because I put it together because I wanted it to be something that we use as opposed to something that we only save for emergencies.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that, like, this kit has, for instance, Snoopy Band-Aids in it. And if you ever have a 3-year-old who's crying and you want him to stop crying after he's bumped his elbow, you put a Snoopy Band-Aid on him and he stops crying. And so I tried to put useful things in this kit.
Yep.
So it has everything from Snoopy Band-Aids to splints for broken arms, and everything in between. And I carry that one in my airplane. I carry one in my car. It's unbelievable how often I use it. And people can actually go to the Aeromedix site and see all the contents of the kit, and they can create their own kit using mine as a basis, or they can buy one from us or whatever. But I think it's important when you're in an airplane that you have a kit. And it's amazing how often you use it. And I'm talking about even things as simple as antacid tablets. When you're flying along and you get a little indigestion, it's kind of nice to have something you can take at that point, as opposed to waiting 2 hours till you land to correct your heartburn.
Absolutely. I think that's a great idea. What we have, we carry with us as pilots, backup radios, backup headset. But hey, like you said, if your stomach is not feeling that great at 5,000 feet and you're nowhere near an airfield, it'd be great if you could just reach into your bag and sort that out. I'm also interested in is travel sickness. I personally have flown with lots of passengers, and on a number of I can count on both hands. I've had a few situations where I've had people throw up into Haribo Starburst mix sweet bags, all sorts of things. And a lot of people prior to taking off, I always ask, part of my pilot brief is do you suffer from travel sickness? And a lot of people know, but on the times where this may be a first experience of flying, then they don't know. In terms of travel sickness relief, I've noticed on your website there is an electronic, and you sort of market it as right. Tech, wearable tech. Right. Explain that, please.
Sure. Well, first, let me say that after having kids who eat Cheetos and vomit in airplanes, never let a kid eat Cheetos, because that stains the fabric forever.
Fantastic.
You can't get that stuff out.
Yeah.
But we've always been looking for air sickness relief, and there are many different kinds of products out there. One thing I do want to point out is that carbon monoxide low-level carbon monoxide exposure will make people more sensitive to motion sickness. So if you're in a power boat going downwind, or you're in an airplane that has a low-level leak, those are things that will actually make people get motion sick much quicker. Okay. But with pilots and motion sickness, the problem is they cannot take medications in the United States. It's not legal to take Dramamine or scopolamine or all the various medications for motion sickness because it affects your ability to pilot an aircraft. So we'd always been looking for things, and when the relief band was developed in the 90s, we jumped on that. And the way that the relief band works is it is an electrical stimulator of the P6 meridian, which is an acupuncture point on the wrist, which is in Western medicine is known as the median nerve. And what it does, it essentially replaces what an acupuncture needle would do, and it gives a little electric shock, and not something that's uncomfortable, but it's like a tingle that stimulates the median nerve, and you feel the kind of tingle in your palm or your third and fourth finger. And that sends a signal that somehow gets transmitted to your stomach, and it reduces the peristaltic waves in your stomach, which essentially stops the nausea and vomiting associated with motion sickness. It actually also works for pregnancy, for the nausea and vomiting associated with pregnancy, and chemotherapy with cancer patients, and also something called post-anesthetic nausea, where people get nauseated from anesthesia and surgery. But it works extremely well, and it could be worn by pilots. Now, most pilots don't get motion sick, but pilots who do, like start in aerobatics, do get motion sick. And so this is really a product that's very, very helpful for pilots who are beginning aerobatics. And of course, it's great for passengers. We've had pilots who tell us that their entire flying career has changed because their spouse will now go with them because they don't get sick, because they wear a relief band, and it stops the problem of motion sickness. And these things are really incredible devices. And I've even used it on my son when we made the crossing across the Drake Passage on the way to Antarctica from South America. And it's an amazing device. It really works incredibly well.
Fantastic. I think my eldest daughter suffers, and she continuously says, she has headaches every time she goes flying. So it's something which I'm personally going to sort of invest in and see what the results are. So it's great. You currently are, lecture extensively and do lots of talks about hypoxia and carbon monoxide. Is this something which you're just passionate about?
Well, I am passionate about it, and part of the problem is that most pilots, unless they succumb to hypoxia at altitude and the jet comes up to check on them because they haven't responded to air traffic control, most hypoxic episodes go unreported. Because if a pilot, for instance, flies into the side of a mountain or goes into a stall and spins an aircraft in, or does something that doesn't seem quite correct, at least in the United States, it gets attributed by the investigators to pilot error. And many times I think that pilot error starts with hypoxia, that the person gets hypoxic and makes some bad decisions or some bad physical maneuvering of the aircraft because of hypoxia. And there's no way to prove hypoxia in a post-mortem exam.
Yeah.
So I think it occurs much more commonly than people think. The same thing occurs with carbon monoxide. I think that pilots become incapacitated from carbon monoxide, and if their body is not recoverable or their body is burnt or whatever in an accident, there's no way to prove that it was carbon monoxide. And just to give you an example of that, I once looked at the record of a customs agent who was flying a aircraft. I believe it was I think it was a Cessna 210, and he was doing a simulated drug drop in the off the coast of Florida, and he was being followed by a Black Hawk helicopter. And he basically was flying this drug drop and literally flew the aircraft right into the water. And of course, the helicopter was right behind him, so they immediately had a rescue diver in the water who saved this guy, and they flew him to an emergency room. And about 6 hours later, even though he had been on high flow oxygen, 6 hours later, one of his family members said, "Have you checked him for carbon monoxide?" Now, I have no idea why the family asked that question, but they did, and they checked him, and he still had high levels of carbon monoxide 6 hours later. Well, if no one had ever asked that question, then he would, and the guy who the pilot had no idea, he had no recollection of the accident whatsoever. But had he died, or no one had asked to check the carbon monoxide level in his bloodstream, that would have been attributed to pilot error or something else, but it would never have been attributed to carbon monoxide. So I think a lot more accidents happen than we know about that are related to carbon monoxide issues. And of course, one of the ways to avoid carbon monoxide at all in aircraft is to fly lean a peak. If you fly lean a peak with gamma ejectors on fuel-injected engines, no carbon monoxide is produced, because carbon monoxide comes from incomplete combustion. And if you're lean a peak, there isn't any incomplete combustion. But that's also one of the reasons why I encourage people to have good carbon monoxide detectors in their aircraft. And there are several brands out there, but the low-level ones I think, are the best. And please do not use those chemical spots that you see on board a lot of people's airplanes. Those things are not only are they useless, but by the time you see that thing change color, you're going to be dead. So it's useless to have an airplane. It's just silliness.
Wow, you say that, and I can visualize almost every single aircraft that I've flown has one of those spots in various precarious locations all over the place.
Yeah. And the other thing about them is they say they expire in 90 days, and nobody replaces them every 90 days. So that's another thing. But it's kind of like in medicine, they always teach us that someone who has carbon monoxide poisoning will be cherry red. Their skin will be cherry red color. Well, that's true, but generally you only see that when they're dead. I mean, that's how high the level has to be. And somebody who's in the emergency room who may have carbon monoxide poisoning, they won't, and they're still alive, they won't be that cherry red color. You just don't see that happen in patients who are still alive.
Fantastic. So that's like a folklore, even medical folklore. Okay.
Yes, it is.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Excellent. So you provided some great advice there. I really appreciate that. And obviously, if people are interested in purchasing some items, you can visit the Aeromedix website, which is Aeromedix, which is MEDIX.com, aeromedix.com. I'll make sure that's linked to on your show notes so everyone can have a look. This is the first time I've had a look. I'm just looking now, and you've got an extensive range of all sorts of stuff, which I like the idea of having a medical kit plus adding some of this technology to that. Especially the carbon monoxide is on my definite shopping list there. So definitely worth checking out.
We also have several articles on that site that I've written, and Mike Bush, who's been with us for a while, has written on the site. There's a lot of information there, not just products, but information your listeners might want to read.
Yeah, so great. Some educational literature and some interesting products as well. So yeah, thank you for that, Brent. Okay, so let's just go back to some flying for a second. So let's have a look. You've mentioned quite a few different aircraft types there. So how many different aircraft types have you flown? And what aircraft, out of all the ones that you've flown to date, do you hold the closest to your heart, and why?
Well, I think that, I've probably flown, I don't know, I don't have that big a list. I would guess about 35 different kinds of aircraft, ranging from, Cessna 150s to, I've had the opportunity to fly left seat in a Stinson trimotor. I've had a lot of experiences, but the one that I think I've held closest to my life has been one called the 𝗂𝗟𝗄𝗽𝗃. The 𝗂𝗟𝗃𝗃 was actually an experimental aircraft. It was a Fleet 16B. It was built in the 30s initially, and then in the early 50s, Ken Flagler put a W670 engine, that's a 220 horsepower Continental engine on it, and he called it a 𝗂𝗟𝗃𝗃 because at that point it became experimental. And he used to tow gliders with it. In fact, he actually towed 2 gliders at once with it. It was a pretty impressive airplane.
Wow, yeah.
And I ended up with that airplane and got a chance to meet Ken and flew that aircraft for many years, and it was just an exciting aircraft to fly, an open cockpit biplane, that was one of a kind, and got to meet the guy that actually built it, 50 years before, and that was really a cool airplane to fly. So I have a Stearman now. It's got a lot more power. It's still fun to fly, but I don't have that close association with it like I did with the 𝗂𝗂𝗽𝗀𝗃.
Yeah. What was it like to fly an experimental aircraft? Most aircraft, we have a pilot operating handbook, a POH, and, what's the situation with an experimental aircraft?
Well, actually, the �υ𝗃, because of when it was built, didn't even have a handbook. I built a Murphy Moose, and you have to write your own handbook then, and you get help from other builders, and you kind of make it happen. But one of the things about flying an experimental aircraft to some extent is that you're a test pilot every flight. So when I built the Murphy Moose, I flew it for a couple of years, and then I ended up not flying it anymore and sold it because I got tired of having to always fix things. I'd much rather fly than fix. So
yeah, absolutely.
Now I have the Cessna 185, which is a very similar aircraft, and because it's certified, I don't have to fix near as many things.
Fantastic. I mentioned also in the bio that you fly the Cessna 340. Could you just explain a little bit about that?
Well, the Cessna 340 is my essentially point A to point B aircraft. I mean, it flies at 200 knots. It flies up to 25,000 feet. It's pressurized. It's just your point A to point B aircraft. I call it transportation as opposed to flying. I call the 185 and the Stearman flying because that's really more about flying low and close to the ground and really just sort of experiencing everything that flying's all about.
Fantastic. One of our previous guests, Rick Dearden, was a lawyer for Cessna, and he had access to the whole of the Cessna stable. And he actually, out of all the aircraft, he called the Cessna 340 was his favorite, and he called it his pocket rocket, his rocket ship. And so I think it's quite, ironic that you have that aircraft, and Rick, fellow aviator, chose that out of the whole of the Cessna stable. So yeah, cool.
Well, it's been a great airplane for living at altitude because, as I said, every flight here is a high altitude flight when you're going point A to point B, and the 340's worked out very well for that.
Fantastic. Okay, so give us an example of your current flying now. What have you been doing recently, flying-wise?
Well, on Saturday, just 2 days ago, I flew the Stearman to a hayfield about 40 miles away for just a local fly-in at a guy's farm in Idaho.
Yeah.
2 days from now, I'm flying the 340 back to Louisville, Kentucky, which is about 1,100 nautical miles for a family event, and then on to Washington, D.C. for another event, and then I'm back home. So that'll be about, before it's over, it'll be close to 16, 17 hours of flight time on the 340. Then my 185 is in the avionics shop up in Billings, Montana, which is about 200 nautical away from us, and I'll be picking that up in the middle of November. So I end up flying quite a bit. I'm doing something with the airplanes as much as I can. My biggest problem is because of where we live in Wyoming, the weather starts getting real cold here shortly, so the Stearman gets put away for the winter pretty much now.
Yeah. I love the way a cyclist will have a different bike for different types of riding, and you've literally got a different aircraft for every perceivable type of flying. So I love that. That's awesome. And you're using them all to the max. It sounds great.
I try to, but I'm very fortunate to be able to have the aircraft. I'm probably over aircraft, but I sure enjoy flying them.
That's great stuff. Okay, so I think you mentioned one thing which you with your son there, but what is your proudest moment in your flying career so far? So tell us that story.
Well, that's a tough question. Proudest moment, certainly getting my airline transport rating. Was a pretty exciting moment to be able to have the same rating as the airline pilots, and that was a pretty proud moment. I think that was probably it, was getting the airline transport rating. I certainly have had various things happen, like engine out emergencies in the 340 and stuff like that, where I've done a good job of getting the airplane safely back on the ground. So those are proud moments too, I guess. But
yeah, very proud.
But getting the ATP, I think, was probably one of the most proud moments.
Okay, and you basically said because you now had the same level of attainment as the airliners. Is that what you're referring to
That's
there?
correct.
Yeah, cool.
That's correct.
All right. And future. So, the Stearman's going to bed now. Obviously, that's the near future. But what's your future plans and aspirations flying wise?
Well, I don't really have anything on the horizon from the point of view of flying. I've been a big proponent of elimination of the third-class medical for pilots in the United States, and I'm working with the AOPA and some congressmen back in Washington to really get some legislation passed to eliminate the third-class medical, because I really think that we're not improving safety in the United States by having the third-class medical. So that's really what my current push is, and so that's sort of my non-flying flying kind of future at the moment.
Okay, so in a nutshell, for people that are not aware of this current issue that you're referring to, could you just explain what this third tier of medical system is?
Right. In the United States, there are three classes of medical. First class are what pilots have to fly scheduled airliners. If they're over 40, it's every 6 months. If they're under 40, it's every year. Charter pilots who fly, freight, they have to have what's called a second class medical, which is basically the same as a first class except without the EKG, and they have to have that every year. And then for general aviation pilots, recreational pilots that aren't flying for hire, they have to have a third-class medical. And a third-class medical is every 2 years if you're over 35. It's every 5 years if you're under 35. And the thing is that a pilot will come to my office and I will do their medical and I will certify them that day that they are healthy and safe to fly. But basically for the next 2 years, every day they get into an airplane, they're self-certifying themselves that they're medically safe to fly. And so the statistics really do not show that we are doing much with the third-class medical. That the accident rates for gliders and light sport pilots and balloon pilots, the medical-related accidents are at the same rate as pilots who fly under a third-class medical. And those people do not need medicals. So I don't think we're really doing anything with third-class medicals. And one of the reasons for doing away with them is it reduces one of the financial and logistical barriers to flying, and we want to get as many people in the air as we can. So there's really a big push right now to eliminate the third-class medical, and as I said, I'm working with the AOPA and congressmen to get some legislation passed so we can eliminate that hurdle so that we can get more people into the air.
Fantastic. And just an observation there, as you are a medical examiner and you are a pilot, I like the way you're still leaning on towards the pro-pilot, pro-flying, rather than, a non-flying aviation medical examiner who might be thinking, hey, I could lose some business here. So I definitely like your stance there.
Thank you.
Okay, Brent, this is my favorite part of the show, the quick fire checklist. This is where I ask you a series of questions and you come back to us, the inspired pilots, with amazing and inspiring answers. How does that sound? You ready?
I'll do my best.
Okay, that's great. What is the best piece of advice related to flying that you've ever received?
Things do not get better when something's starting to go wrong. In other words, you have to do something to intercede when there's a problem. If you're flying into bad weather, continuing flying into the bad weather isn't going to make it better. You've got to do something different. And that's probably the best advice that I've gotten from people. Same thing with if your engine sounds funny, if you don't do anything, it's going to sound worse and worse.
Fantastic. I love that. I'm smiling my face off now. That is like the most obvious piece of advice ever, but it's so true. Fantastic. Do you have a favorite internet flying resource that you'd like to share with the listeners?
I think Aviation Consumer is a great resource. It's a magazine, online and offline, and I mean in print. And I think it's a very, very good, objective evaluator of aircraft accessories, and that sort of thing.
Excellent. Yep, I read that as well. Aviation Consumer Magazine. So I'll make sure that's linked to in your show notes. Okay. Can you share one of your personal habits, Brent, that you find useful and believe contributes to your flying success?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
I think that if I were to say something that I pay more attention to now than I ever have is I do not overestimate my stamina. And what I mean by that is when I was younger, I would make very long trips after, a long day of work. And I realize now that that's not a good thing, that fatigue is a huge factor in contributing to accidents. And so I really try to plan trips now so there's much more rest periods, so there's more time between legs, or that I'll take 2 days to do a trip that I probably could have done in 1 day if necessary, to prevent that fatigue factor from contributing to a problem in the aircraft.
Fantastic. Forward thinking and planning. Excellent. Okay, trikes or tail draggers, Brent?
Well, if you're going to the backcountry, you can't beat a tail dragger. But I think for most pilots, the tricycle gear is a safer aircraft because they're just easier to land.
Fantastic. Good. Okay, can you recommend one aviation-related book?
Well, Rick Durden's book, the pilot you've previously mentioned, has written a great book. Unfortunately, the name of the book escapes me, but it's Rick Durden's book, and I know it's available on Amazon. But he's written a great book, and it's a collection of aviation articles about flying that I think is really excellent.
Yeah, the Thinking Pilot's Handbook. It's a great
That's
book.
it.
Yeah, it's right by my bed. I'm going through that story by story. Yeah, great stuff. But I'll make sure that's linked to in your show notes. Okay, what is your favorite non-essential but essential to you, Brent, technology gadget in your cockpit?
Oh, without question, the XM Weather. XM Weather on even a handheld like a 496 or 396 Garmin is absolutely the most important thing safety-wise I think has been developed in the last 50 years. Having onboard weather, if you're doing point A to point B kind of work is incredibly important, and I think the most important safety thing that's come up in the last 50 years.
Okay, so prior to XM Weather, you would do all your weather planning up front before you take off. So how has this device helped you? Can you give us sort of like an example of how it's helped you in flight?
Yes. First thing is there's a big difference between a briefing that's before you fly and also even talking to somebody on the radio about flying when you're talking about a pictorial presentation verbally versus actually seeing the picture. Big difference. So to give you an example of something that happened to me once, I was flying from Phoenix, Arizona to Jackson, which is about a 4-hour flight, and I was over the Salt Lake City area, and I was running into an overcast. I was IFR, that wasn't a problem, but I started picking up a little bit of ice. And it was not a lot of ice, but over the next hour of flight, it would have been a lot of ice. And I could tell by looking at the XM Weather that if I just turned right about 15 miles, that I would be out of the cloud cover for the entire rest of the trip. And so I was able to turn right 15 miles, travel the same course, the same northerly course, and then turn back into the clouds just to land. And that saved me having to deal with ice or even landing because of the ice. And I could have never have known that with a verbal description, because it would have been very hard for not only for the briefer to tell me where exactly the cloud cover ended, but he wouldn't know exactly where I would have been. Yeah. So there would have been a mismatch. So that's one of the areas where I think that the XM Weather is incredibly valuable, the onboard weather. And now, of course, with the ADS-B, you can get that weather for free through your iPad and an ADS-B receiver, which there's lots of portable receivers out there now. So you don't even have to subscribe. You can get that for free at this point, at least in the United States. The ADS-B input weather from the government is not quite as good graphically as the XM Weather, but it's still very good.
Great. A great anecdote there to support XM Weather, so thank you for that. Okay, here's my favorite question now. So if you had a time machine and could go back in time and meet your younger self, Brent, just as you were about to start your flying journey, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give yourself?
Well, I think I already covered that with a different instructor. I think that choosing the right instructor, I think, is critically important. I really do. And I would have chosen a different instructor. But other than that, I think that I've been pretty fortunate in having made for the majority of right decisions in my aviation career.
Yeah, your journey definitely sounds very blessed. So yeah, I understand that. Okay, Brent, thank you for the stories you've shared. You've given us some great insight, especially around the medical side and related to hypoxia and carbon monoxide in the cockpit. So that's great. And I'm sure the listeners are going to pick up some tidbits and learn from that. Can you give the audience of Inspired Pilots one last piece of guidance, then share how people can get in contact with you, and then we'll sign off?
It's easy to contact me. It's just Brent.Blue, Brent.Blue, at aeromedix.com. Aeromedix is AEROMEDIX.com. And I think that probably the most important advice is, and it's sort of a cliche, safety doesn't come naturally. And it's one of those things that we have to work at safety with every flight, with every pre-flight. And it's very, very important to think about safety all the time. And I think that most accidents that we see could have been prevented if safety had been utmost in the pilot's mind. And when I say that, you say, okay, well, when the engine throws a valve and shuts down and somebody crashes, that they couldn't have prevented that. Well, that may be true, but if you lose an engine and you've been paying attention to what you've been flying over and you've been picking out places to land that you might have to do an emergency landing at the entire trip, then you may have a much higher survival rate than if you haven't been paying attention at all. So that's one of the kind of things that when I'm talking about safety, it's not something that necessarily you think about all the time. But, when we're student pilots, we always are taught, look for places to land. After you've got a few thousand hours, you may not be looking for that place to land because you get so used to having your engine being so reliable. And so I think that these are things that are important, that it's always important to think about safety all the time. What can we do to make this flight safer? Is there anything we're doing wrong? Is there anything we're doing right that we might be able to improve on? I think those are important issues.
Fantastic bit of advice there. Think about safety all the time. Okay, Brent, thank you for joining us on the show, for your time today. You've been extremely generous. On behalf of the Inspired Pilots, I'd like to say thank you and speak to you again.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, thank you so much for joining me today for episode 22 of the Inspired Pilot Podcast. It was really great talking to Brent as a pilot, aircraft owner, aviation medical examiner, and a successful online aviation business. The list goes on. I think it's safe to say that Brent has immersed himself in aviation. I like it from the early days when Brent incorporated aviation and specifically flying into his everyday life, and it's something which I'm definitely striving to do myself, so I'm working on it still. Initially, in Brent's case, it was a means to getting to and from his emergency room moonlighting job, but now it's a key part of his everyday life with the Stearman and the Cessna 185 for fun, in quotes, and the 340 for transportation. How cool is that? Obviously, having the means and access to the aircraft is a whole different matter, but it's definitely an inspiration lifestyle on whatever level you choose. My biggest takeaway from this episode is definitely the detailed information shared regarding hypoxia and carbon monoxide in the cockpit. Like, how scary is that? They both are real and significant risks, but the good thing is that there are inexpensive, relative to aviation anyway, devices that monitor O2 levels in your blood and can detect carbon monoxide at low levels, and therefore giving you, as the pilot, more choices. Life is all about choices, right? Okay, Brent and Aeromedix have generously provided the Inspired Pilot podcast listeners with a special discount offer for use on their Aeromedix online store. So all you need to do is visit aeromedix.com, that's aeromedix.com, and use the coupon code INSPIRED15 at the checkout to receive a $10 discount on your order. Cool. I personally will be investing in a low-level carbon monoxide detector, and I'm really curious and a little bit nervous about what results I'll find on a typical flight, so I'll let you guys know how I get on. So that's aeromedix.com and use the coupon code INSPIRED15 for $10 off. Okay, don't forget to head over to the show's website, inspiredpilot.com. That's where you're going to find the show notes for this and every episode. You can also leave a comment for Brent directly on the page and find the links to all the resources mentioned and much, much more. I really appreciate receiving feedback about the show, so do get in touch. I reply to every single email, and you can find me on Facebook and Twitter. If you do like the show, I'm really grateful if you share it with your fellow AvGeeks friends and colleagues. And if you haven't already subscribed to the Inspired Pilot new episode and updates email list, then go ahead and do that on the website, inspiredpilot.com. I have some great upcoming guests and a load of other cool stuff in the pipeline also, so make sure you're signed up. Okay, that's it for now, and don't forget, wherever you are on your pilot journey, get ready to be inspired.